There have been polls, some of them taken by Florida International University, where it's clear that a majority of Cubans support a change in policy, including a change in the embargo. So attitudes have changed dramatically, and I think the president is on solid political ground in making this shift.
For more than 50 years, Cuba's remained a nation where people are dying to be free, and that means leaving any way they can. And one that Americans really know very little about, save for the smuggled pieces of information. So let's welcome to MidPoint, Professor of Government at American University, co-author of the fascinating book, Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. William LeoGrande joins us today. William, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be with you.
All right, let's talk about your trip to Cuba, Bill, because you were actually there on the ground when the president announced his new edicts, if you will. What was the reaction there, or did the people really know much when it actually happened?
Oh, people were very, very much aware of it. There was really jubilation in Cuba because people felt like it was equivalent to the end of a war, the end of 50 years of hostility between the two countries. And I think a lot of Cubans expect that as a result of this, U.S.-Cuban economic relations are going to expand and the Cuban economy will get better. I mean, they've been told for 50 years that the U.S. embargo was one of the main reasons for economic problems on the island. So they think the normalization of relations means an end to the embargo and therefore economic growth.
Now there's part of the issue. Let me stop you there for a sec, because
Sure.
Isn't it possible that while the Cuban people there think, wonderful, embargo stopped, things are going to get better, that they're being still played to this day to the nth degree by the Castro regime?
Well, the embargo hasn't gone away, of course. That wasn't part of the agreement. The embargo, for the most part, is still very much in place. But the Cuban government under Raul Castro has actually been a lot more candid about its own economic problems. For the last several years, he's been warning Cubans that the problem is as much their own domestic economic model as it is the embargo. And he gave a speech to the Cuban National Assembly just 2 days ago in which he tried to lower expectations about whether better relations with the United States was going to cause any quick changes in the economic situation.
We hear an awful lot, and again, as I mentioned, only 90 miles away from the United States, but we hear so many stories about Cuba. We hear that it's people that are poverty-stricken, and of course we know about the fact that the infrastructure is very difficult, and the fact that the government lives high on the hog. You've been there, you're on the ground. What's the reality of the situation with regard to the Cuban people?
Well, it is a poor country, and a lot of Cubans, particularly those who are working in the state sector of the economy and are paid in Cuban pesos, which are not worth very much in dollar terms, they scrape to get by. You don't see the kind of wrenching poverty that you do in some countries because they do have free health care, free education, the cost of housing is relatively low. But one of the things that's happened in the last few years is a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots as the economy has become more market-oriented.
With regard to that disparity between the haves and the have-nots, we're going to talk about that after the break a little bit, but let me broach it now for just a moment. Do you really think, and are the people there, well, let's get your opinion first. Do you really think that if things do change here, that that gap will shrink? Because it would seem to some that the Cuban government, they kind of love having their big houses right now, their newer cars and everything they have. Why should they give it away under a communistic flag?
No, actually, inequality, I think, is going to be getting wider. As the government allows more free play of the market, there are some winners and there are some losers. There are people who are doing very, very well in their private restaurants and their private farms. And then there's people in the state sector of the economy who are being laid off from their jobs as the state enterprises have to now begin to compete with the private sector. So it's not so much the bureaucrats taking privileges, although there is some of that, but it's really the operation of the market itself that's exaggerating some of the inequalities.
All right, 15 seconds before we take a break. Do you think the president got it right?
I do think he got it right. There's still a long way to go. There's still a lot of issues between Cuba and the United States. But I think he changed the framework in the same way that Nixon did when he went to China in 1972.
Okay, please stand by just a couple of moments here. More with Professor William LeoGrande after the break. The reality of what to expect and what we can gain from Cuba with more Americans on the ground. And here's always a great question. Why anybody should trust that government and why they trust it'll change once the Castros do die out. Will happen eventually. We'll Coming back on MidPoint. Let's welcome back to MidPoint, Professor of Government at American University, co-author of the book Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. William LeoGrande joins us. Bill, before we continue on and talk about the Castros, question that just came to mind that actually I was asked by a friend of mine who lives in the Pacific Northwest. She said, I live here. I don't care what happens in Cuba. It's a little country. It doesn't faze me at all. It's nothing there that I need. So here's a great question. Most of America, why is it important to them that we have diplomatic relations and have trade once again with Cuba?
Well, I think there are a couple good reasons. One is that normal relations will help us to avoid the kind of migration crises that we had in 1980 with the Mariel boat lift and the 1994 rafters crisis. It may not affect people in the Northwest, but it had a huge effect on people in Florida. The other reason is that even though it's a small island, Cuba does offer us some economic opportunity for trade, for investment. You know, before 1959, Cuba had more U.S. direct investment than any other country in Latin America. And finally, there are a lot of issues these days that are transnational. They can't be solved by one country because they don't respect borders. The Ebola crisis is a good example of that. Hurricane preparedness and warning systems, another good example. So there are lots of reasons why we should have normal relations with our closest neighbors.
Is it also possible, too, that because the Castros say that it will remain a socialistic country, it will stay under the banner of communism, that perhaps being at least a little closer to them in name, perhaps, lets us keep a closer eye on a group and on a country where we know the Russians have had workings and dealings before?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. Vladimir Putin was in Cuba not too long ago. He's clearly trying to reestablish Russia's global preeminence or global power. And the Cubans were interested in getting some trade credits from Russia to help their economy. I don't think the Cubans want to go back to being a pawn between two superpowers, however. So I don't think we need to see that as a geostrategic problem. On the other hand, normalizing relations with Cuba and moving a little closer there does give the Cubans less of an incentive to get back in bed with the Russians.
Do you get the feeling that when the Castros die out, let's be very frank here, Raul and Fidel are going to die one day, and probably very soon. They're both in their 80s, I believe. But there are people who believe that then the government would change and it might get better. But what about the other side? There are younger men there in their 50s that are actually devotees and followers of the Castro regime. So what's to believe that they'll change anything? They might even make it worse, yes?
Well, I don't think they'd make it worse. So the younger generation, I think, is more realistic than some of the older generation about the nature of Cuba's problems. And to give Raul Castro credit where credit is due, he started saying a number of years ago that the old model didn't work anymore and needed to be changed. So he's already set in motion a kind of transition to a China-style market socialism. And I think the people that will follow him are likely to stay on that course. I think it's irreversible. I don't think they can go back to the old Soviet hyper-centralized planning system that they had for the first 40 years of the revolution.
I got about 30, 40 seconds left here. Do you think that if Venezuela wasn't imploding, that Raul Castro would have ever agreed to anything?
Oh, I think he would. He's been trying ever since he came into office to improve relations with the United States. Just like Gorbachev wanted to end the Cold War so that he could focus on reorganizing the Soviet economy, Raul Castro wanted to end the Cold War in the Caribbean so he could focus on reorganizing the Cuban economy.
Can America trust him?
Well, as Ronald Reagan said, when negotiating with adversaries, trust but verify.
And you have this odd feeling that from now on, at least, as long as the Americans are in bed with the Cubans, they're going to trust and verify forever, correct?
Well, I think, our government is pretty good about keeping track of these things. There's not much Cuba can do that poses a real threat to the United States.
Which is where we're going to have to end it here. And, of course, there's a lot of people that I know that are very happy, and some, of course, who say that the president got rooked. Either way, we're going to continue this conversation. The book is called Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, and there have been a lot of them. William LeoGrande, Bill, thanks so much for joining us. A very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you and your family.
And same to you.
Take care. Break, and we're back with our holiday gift to you, guaranteed to produce peals of laughter without making fun of any specific politician. The Lord knows we tried. It's coming up next right here on MidPoint.